and we're going to get into a couple things today. Okay, so first off, I'm going to start up our server. And we still see our restaurants. One thing I figured out, the thing I was looking into last time in React hooks, you notice how like we had that issue where it kept fetching to the back end. This little warning right here is phenomenal. It says, hey, you're using this thing called get restaurants inside of our hook, and I have no idea what it is. And basically, if we tell it in our use effect, if we go ahead and say, hey, our dependency here is get restaurants, it will wait for get restaurants to change before updating. And since get restaurants doesn't change, it will only run once. So it's even easier than I thought it was. If we just give it the function get restaurants, which it's like, hey, I should be tracking this anyways, it will go ahead and just run it once. So I'm going to double check that that's correct. We can save this and refresh the page. We don't get that error anymore. And if we look at our Redux store, we only execute get restaurants once. So all we're doing here is use effect is very picky about like when you start writing things in here, especially if you start like doing your own function in here, grabbing IDs, things like that, it wants to know about them so that if it changes, it can run the code again. So if you give it like an ID and then that ID changes, it should run that whole thing again. Does that make sense to everybody? You just feed it in as the second argument of an array of all of the dependencies, all the things that it should keep a watch on. And if it changes, then it's going to run use effect again. If it doesn't change, we're good. But it should know about them. Otherwise, it's going to warn you about it. And by doing this, since get restaurants is a function that doesn't change, it'll happen only once. Previously, my solution to doing this, I think was wrong. I decided to just pass in the restaurants array, which first off will change once when we get the fetch back. So that will make it happen at least 2 times. And JavaScript doesn't have an innate way to compare 2 arrays to each other. So I think that might have been causing a comparison issue too. Like if I went ahead and said, hey, is 1, 2 equal to 1, 2, it'll say false. Yeah. You feeling okay about this? Are you just like taking the this on faith at this point? Are you like, cool, whatever, you've got it. Seems like you know what's up.
Wait, why is that?
Why is this? Like, why is
false?
This not a thing? JavaScript won't tell you if 2 arrays are equal to each other. They'll only tell you if it's the same array. So I can go it won't go ahead and double exactly. Raquel's exactly right. In memory, these are the first one are 2 different arrays. These are just 2, like it doesn't go ahead and automatically compare each element to see if they're correct. But if we set them equal to if we like grab this like array, we can check to see if it's the exact same array, right? If you ever really need to compare 2 arrays, my favorite one to do. Clearly, I've done this before. That'll work because you just go ahead and say like, turn both these arrays into strings and then compare those 2 strings. It's goofy, but it exists. We're in JavaScript. There's a lot of things to hate about it. But this way, we don't have to worry about it. We're saying, hey, use the get restaurants of function in your use effect. and it's our only dependency. So only run it when this changes. Cool. If we eventually throw an ID in here, right, and make that ID subject to change, it'll run it again and again, which is kind of cool because we're going to need that later, probably. But for now, this works. We all see it? And this is kind of how it rolls up component did update into use effect in the same way it rolls up component did mount. This is how you tell it when it should update. When one of the items in this array changes, then it'll go ahead and rerun this. And I'm going to show you a little bit later today how we can then do component will unmount inside use effect. Cool. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and our next step really, first off, I mentioned before, this is not good JavaScript. We have snake case here, right? Where we should have a camel case, right? And this is your final project, so you should probably change that. I'm going to go over to active model serializers GitHub page. If you go into the documentation, they give you a really useful tool for dealing with this, which I've shown a couple of you before. But if we go to general, you will find this thing called key transforms, and it will tell you how to go ahead and transform a serializer. First off, if I just want to transform it in one specific render call, I could do it like this. I'd be like, hey, I want it to be a camel lower. Or if I want to change all of it, I need this code to run once in my Ruby code, which will go ahead and go into our active model serializers class, grab this config object, grab key transform from it, and set it equal to camera lower. And then from then on, every single time this serializer sends data out, it will send it out in lower camel case. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So we can go over here. And my advice, whenever you're trying to change the config options of one of your gems, right? The best place for you to do it is in your initializers. You can just go ahead and create a new file. I'm going to call this one serializers.rb. I'm just going to paste this code in here. I'm going to restart my Rails app. And then we should see that now if I go to localhost 3000/restaurants, we now have them not underscored, but camel cased. It's a really useful tool for just making translating between JavaScript and React and Rails. Did people see what I did at all? Is anyone like, what were you doing this whole time? We all cool? Awesome. So at this point, something will break. I can go over here and I'm going to refresh this page and it'll be like, the name is the same because the name was a single word, so it didn't need to be underscored or camel cased. But the images are gone, and so are the kind of foods. We can go change that right here. Boop, boop. Image URL and kind of food. Nice. We're back. How are we feeling on that? Cool little tool. Thumbs up, thumbs sideways, thumbs down. Cool. So now next up, right? We probably want these to lead somewhere, right? We want to be able to click on these and go to a show page for it, right? This sounds like it's time for us to start building out React Router. And I mentioned today in the Slack channel, but in case you didn't see this, React Router has had an update. Now, if you go ahead and are foolish enough to say npm add React Router, we will see. It's going to take a second. We will see that it will install React Router 6.0. If we go over to our package.json, you will see React Router 6.0. Oh, right. It's actually React Router DOM. So this is silly in two ways. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this. You are welcome to use React 6. I haven't looked into it yet because I found out about it today. Glad to, if that's what we want to do for the rest of the lecture instead of doing other things. But if you don't want to have to learn React Router, like the new version of React Router, now that you just learned the old one a week ago, first off, you should do it eventually. But for now, if you don't want to, if you want like yours to be on the older version, first off, it's React Router DOM, not React Router. You can go ahead and do this @ symbol to say this version number, and then give whichever version number you want to use. In this case, we've been using 5.2.0. Cool. And the @ symbol is universally how you specify the version number you want to use in an npm package when you're using npm add. Cool. Y'all see this? Boop. It's cool though, right? That React Router had an update today, like, or very recently. This is gonna be your dev job forever. Is going to be like, hey, they updated new things, right? You have to pay attention to them and read the blogs and change things out. Rip. Yep, that happens. But that's part of being a developer, and the fact that these things keep updating means there's many more jobs because it's a lot of work to keep updated. Cool. So here, I went ahead and installed React Router DOM 5.2, and now you can see in our package.json, it's 5.2. We see that? Cool. So for the next step, we can just go ahead and use it. Import browser router as router, or as yeah, well, we won't name it something cool or interesting, from React Router DOM. Cool. And now we can just go ahead and do router/router. Yeah, we're using the old version right now because I didn't want to teach you all new stuff today, and I also still haven't had time to look into the documentation. But yeah. Cool. So the way I made it, if you are going to be using React Router DOM, remember, npm add React Router DOM, and you need to be using React Router. This is like a requirement, right? This will give you the wrong version. This will give you 6, or not the wrong version, the newest version. If you want to use the older version, at 5.2.0. Cool. And I'll probably drop that in the Slack channel too. So now, if we go over to our app, we can go ahead and do our old-fashioned switch case.
Now the switch case is like switching over routes.
Yeah,
or-
it's
yeah.
this is one of the things they got rid of in the new one. Now it's just you say routes in general, but switch says, hey, what follows here is a series of route components, and it will render the first one that matches. So what this looks like is something like this: /restaurants. This is one way to do it. You can also do component equals this bad boy if you want to make sure that you have the route props. In this case, we don't really need the route props for anything because I'm going to be using only functional components, which can use hooks. So I'm going to go ahead and just do this way. Oops. And I'm going to go ahead and add another path /restaurants/ID. And this one will eventually go to something that I will call restaurant show. How is this code for people? Do we want to dive into it in detail? You feeling cool? What happens if I do this? I just moved this down.
It would show the specific restaurant.
Not
Whether
quite.
oh,
If it's
So check
here,
that one first.
yeah. This way is the right way over this way, right? Because the switch case will pick the first route that matches its parameters. Now, if I typed in /restaurants/12, I want it to go to the show page, right? That's my ideal. That's where I want it to go, right? If I move this way, it will see this and it'll be like, oh, this actually matches /restaurants. And then it will show the index page and it'll ignore any future routes. So the big rule of routing, once again, go from most specific to least specific. Cool. So here, I'm going to create a restaurant show.js. And I've been kind of, oh, let's actually do this first. Function restaurant show. Oop, props. Return h1. You're in the show page now. Cool. Could make a comment about showbiz or something, but I'm feeling lazy a little bit right now. Cool. So really quickly to double check that everything works here. I'm going to import restaurant show from ./components/restaurant show. Awesome. And now we can test that this works. First off, oops. If we run this. Oh, I put it in containers. Get out of there. It might eventually be a container, but right now it's firmly a component to me. And we need to go ahead and export default restaurant show. So now if we go to localhost 3001, we don't see anything because nothing matches our paths. We'll probably fix that eventually. But if we go to /restaurants, we see all of our restaurants. And if we go to restaurant/12, we see you're in the show page now. Cool. How we doing? One trick that I haven't shown you that I kind of kept promising to show you. At a certain point, it gets annoying to write this as, oh yeah, Naomi, what's up?
how do you know when to put stuff in the container and the component?
A container's job is to basically render out a bunch of components, and that's its primary purpose, right? So here, restaurant index's job is strictly to get a bunch of restaurants, or a list of all of our restaurants in an array, and turn each item in the restaurants class into a new component called restaurant card. Its job is to contain a bunch of components. So I put this in containers. Whereas restaurant card, its job is just to show a card. That's a component, right? It's just appear on a page in a specific way. That's a component. A container's job is usually to just go ahead and show other components that are going to be children of it. Does that make sense? In this case, we're mapping through an array of restaurants that we're getting from a Redux store and returning a bunch of components that will all be rendered out. So you'll notice if we go to our restaurants page, right? This is this right here, this big section right here. Let's go ahead and do a little. This whole thing is our restaurant index, right? this whole box, it's all of these components. But inside of them, each of them are a kind of a child element. Kae Ocho, chick. These are all instances of restaurant card components. And the job of our big red box is just to render out the little boxes, right? And since this job is just to render out the little boxes, it's a container. Make sense? Cool. Oop.
So like, okay, so the child components, yeah, it's pretty much like the presentational
Mhm.
component. And okay, I see what you mean. Okay, never mind.
Cool. So one thing that I did want to show you all at one point, importing a bunch of things as different lines can be really annoying, right? Like you've seen apps where you've like written this, it's like 12 different import lines, all to different components. And you probably want to like be like, hey, how can I make this a one-line thing? I'm going to go show you how to do that now. Is that cool? There's a little trick that I learned from, I don't fully get it. This is a trick I learned from Karen McCarthy, who's another instructor. She works in the in-person program, or she did. And she actually like was a React developer before that. So basically you can go ahead and add this. I'm going to call this index.js because it allows me to do a cool thing. And I'm going to here do, so I'm just double checking. I think it is default as restaurant card from /restaurant card. Hey, grab restaurant card from the same directory we're in and export it. Cool. Do this a couple more times. Cool. So we're grabbing all of these bad boys right here. I don't know why it's lighting up differently. But now I should be able to, if I've gotten the syntax correctly, I should be able to just go ahead and say import restaurant index restaurant show from /components. I don't even have to say index.js because it'll automatically do that, I think. Oh, I think I screwed up one thing, which is just from containers /restaurant index. And now this still works. This still works. And our import app is now one line of just all the components we want. And we can do that on every single page that we want. So we can go ahead and in our restaurant index, we can go say, hey, import restaurant card from /components. In that case, we're moving out of the containers folder and into components. But yeah, so yeah. Oh my, that's right. This is just a separate file of everything that just exports all of our components for us, so that we can import them from one file instead of from several different ones.
So even if we have like different folders, like different components, different actions, it's still just referenced from one place.
Yeah. So in this case, the way I'm handling two different folders is going out and going into containers. I'm throwing in the components folder. I think that's fine. I don't know if there's like a specific design pattern for where you're supposed to do it in the container component structure, but this works for me. Cool. If you don't care about it, you can always do it the old fashioned way, but this leads to some neater imports. You all feeling good? Cool. Exactly. If we don't like this, also has the side effect of making sure everything's in one place. And if you need to update the path for something, you only need to update in one place. Cool. I'm moving everything up. Great. So I'm going to go ahead. Definitely push this up to GitHub now. Add React router. Export components. Oop. Cool. And then might as well also on the back end too. Change key transform config. Oops. There we are. Cool. Nice. All right. So next up, we should actually build out the show page, right? So there's a couple things we need to do. First off, right now, if I go to /restaurant localhost 3000 /restaurant /12, I don't get anything, right? So we can go over to our restaurants controller. We can do a little def show action right here. Right. So this is going to take in a ID from wherever from our route, right? So if we fetched a restaurant /12, it should give us that one. Then it's going to find that restaurant, render that restaurant. Cool. The one issue. So I do this. It's not all of the information from the back end. I had that fixed in our serializer. Cool. So I'm actually going to use two serializers when we are doing this. So I'm going to do like Rails G serializer, and I'm just going to call this restaurant show. And here, I'm gonna pull up our schema next to it. Boop. Here we could add name, URL, flat, long, image, URL, address, kind of food, zip code. We probably don't need the Yelp ID, so I'm not going to include it. Cool. And then all I need to do to make this use a different serializer is go ahead and do serializer restaurant show serializer. I'm going to save this. I think this works without having to restart, but we might have to restart. Nope, this works. Cool. So you can just pass in a serializer. The one note is if I had done this the reverse way, if I wanted this to use the serializer, you go over here to restaurants. This still uses the old serializer. If I want to use this serializer here, I couldn't just do this. I believe. Hopefully, if I'm remembering this correctly. It goes ahead and says, hey, I have no idea what you're doing here. Cool. The reason for this is because restaurant has all these methods. Has all the methods here: ID, name, URL, latitude, longitude, image, URL, address, kind of food, and zip code. Restaurants is an active record relation. It's an array, basically. So if I want to use it, I just have to go ahead and say each serializer. Say, do the serializer for each one. And I think this works. Nice. Cool. Just a little bit more detail on the serializers. In this case, if I'm going through an array of items and I want to manually specify a serializer, I have to use the each serializer tool. Cool. Y'all all right with that? Just some serializer facts. Awesome. Boop. And we're back. This still works. And if we go to restaurant/12, nothing happens because we haven't done anything yet. How are we feeling so far? Have I lost anyone on anything? I'm just showing some new technologies, tools, and a little bit more detail because I think you're going to stumble on some of these issues. But we can now go ahead, leave our backend behind once again. With one exception, I'm probably going to want to keep this up for a sec. Our restaurant show, therefore, should now be able to fetch to this backend. We need to do a couple things to make that happen, though. Specifically, we need a new fetch request and a new action. Now, I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of this for us. Get restaurant, 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 get restaurant. What do I need to change to make this work? Anyone know how to make this fetch for a show action? Anyone want to lead me through it?
You would add a parameter of ID in the argument for this function, and then you would plot that, you would append that to the URL in the fetch.
Nice. So this case, the only thing we really have to do differently is remember that your map dispatch to prop actions from your action creators can totally take in arguments. That's fine. It's really helpful for them to, right? Because often we want to send information in with it, right? Like our payload is usually relies on information we get from the stuff, from like what user input or from what they've clicked or something like that. And it would be pain to like hard code each individual item. So if we want to like make it dependent on whichever ID we give it, we can go ahead and use this. Great. Do you need to talk a little bit more about this? Our next step is to make it so that the reducer can handle it. So right now we have this get restaurants. I'm going to do a new case that I'm going to call get restaurant. Cool. And here, eventually we don't want to change the restaurants array in Redux. We probably want something like a selected restaurant in our index. Yeah. There's probably going to be an object that has a ton of different information in it we get from our backend. Do people see where I'm going with this, or do we want to dig into selected why we need a selected restaurant in our Redux store a little bit more? Yeah. So basically right now, we need some place to store the information we get from our fetch when we go to a show page, right? And depending on if that show page changes, we might be getting different restaurant data each time, right? So storing this in, first off, storing this in state makes it much easier to render and makes it so that we can use our dispatch actions, right? And storing it as a selected restaurant makes it so that we just have all of our restaurant data in one place. This is as opposed to our restaurants array, which is used by our index. So this is going to have all of the data that we need to make this work, and we're going to give it the nil case. And if it's a little bit unclear right now, it'll become more clear when we have this working. But right now, all we're doing is we're setting a restaurant in our state. Naomi, what's up?
So all the restaurants are in the array, and then the selected restaurants is the instance of that specific restaurant.
Yeah. And they're for two
Okay.
different pages, right? This right, the restaurants array is for this page, right? Our selected restaurant is for when we go into the show page. Cool.
So this way we don't have to like pass in the props from the parent to the show page.
Yeah. And since, especially because we're getting much more information when we go to our show page is going to give us not just the name, image URL, and kind of food and the ID, but also it's like latitude, it's longitude, it's URL, it's image URL, it's address, it's kind of food, everything. Cool. So we can go ahead and basically you'll notice these are the camel case or the camel case versions of these ones right here. I'm just going to copy and paste from here, or we can go ahead and just whoop, whatever. Oops. There we are. No, come on, buddy. Sorry, my shortcuts are always confusing because I use the same keyboard for my Mac and my Windows. Oop. Nice. That's incredibly worse than what I was planning on doing. Let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and just write this out rather than try to do something clever. Name, in this case, an empty string, right? Because we always use whichever the null case is for that specific data type. And we know that this is going to be a string. It says string right here. URL, also an empty string. Lat, that can be 0. Long, that can also be 0. Is that the North Pole or the South Pole? Is that out? If someone knows, sound off in chat. Oh, I think you probably need like 0 degrees north or 0 degrees. But then how does my longitude work as a float? It doesn't say north or anything, does it? Oh, they use negative numbers. Smart. Is 0 the equator?
It's actually a place called Null Island. It's like off of Africa.
It's called Null Island.
No, I'm kidding.
Nice. That's where they kept Kong in that recent movie. That's amazing. I'm really glad I learned that. Oh, so we're going to have the selected restaurant default to Null Island. Cool. But it is on the equator, right? Vaguely.
Yeah, it's like off the coast of Africa, like the west coast.
Gotcha.
Many restaurants there.
Cool. So here we can now go ahead, return ... state. And then restaurant or selected restaurant. Whatever we get back from the action.payload. I just realized we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves in making, like, actually building this out. So I'm going to just console log action.payload. And our goal here will be to eventually make this console log work. Cool. So over here, and there, I'm going to do a little bit more refactoring in a bit. But over here, we can go back to our restaurant show page. Our action creators has this get restaurant. And now we're going to need to do a couple of things to make this work. First, in our restaurant index, we might as well start this linking thing now, or a restaurant card. We can do a little import link from React router. Grab our ID from our props, which we can do because in our restaurant index, we are just sending over all of our data from the array. So we didn't use our ID, but we have it here. This isn't just something you can magically do. You can't just summon an ID by doing it here. It only works if we pass it in as prop. And then here, I'm just gonna go ahead and console.log ID. Nice, we've got all of our IDs. And then here, I'm going to make it so that if you click on the name, it goes to restaurants. Oops. Let's go ahead. Restaurants. Ooh, right. I need this. The reason it's mad at me is because I am writing JavaScript inside my JSX. /link. I might as well make the image link too. Not the kind of food. If they're clicking on that, that might be something else. They're probably just hungry for Thai food. So now I'm just making these both links using this link property from React Router DOM, or this link element component that can wrap out around anything and make it into a link. So we can check that this works. Cool. We now have links here. If I click here, this works. If I click here, this works. Do you want to go over that more? Are you all comfortable with link yet? It's cool. Great. So this is all we need in our restaurant card to make this part work, right? We're here now. And now in our restaurant show page, right? We're probably going to need some way to get our ID from the route. Fortunately, React Router gives us a way to do it. Now, unfortunately, if we go to the docs, it's going to give us the version 6 docs. So if you ever want to see the previous versions, you can go down here and it'll still be there. And we can now go over to our happy little hooks area, and use params is going to give us exactly what we need. So I'm going to go ahead and import this, and then we can console log it. Import use params from React Router DOM. Cool. Console.log the result of the function I'm invoking use params. Cool. We will see. If you refresh the page, we get inside of our params an ID equal to 1. Where's the word ID come from?
Our serializer.
At one point, we've used the ID from our serializer, but actually,
We
right?
sent it over from the link we just made.
So the link we just made right here, this word ID resolves to like 1 or 2. This isn't quite where we get the ID of serializer. If I want to change this right here, if I did call this like, I call this let Batman equal ID, right? And call these both Batman. We would still get ID equal 1. The word ID in our route props comes from here. We did a colon ID right here, and React Router is smart enough to know when you write colon something, that's where a param is going to go. So if I call this cheese, right? It's now cheese. Yep. It's not a competition. This is review. So here we are. This is now ID 1, which is awesome. We just, with only our use params hook, which is amazing, we went ahead and grabbed this information. If you aren't using hooks, you're gonna have to do a couple more steps. You're gonna have to like do that, pass down your history from your route props, and then use it there. But if we have this, we can just go ahead and say const route ID equals use params dot ID. Nice. Now console log route ID. And we get 1. Nice. Cool. Now that we have this ID, we can go ahead and use it to make a fetch request to our backend to select that specific restaurant and then add it to a Redux store. It allows us to see our route params, right? So in this case, right, it allows us to see that anything we typed in here becomes our params, right? In this, when it matches this route, it goes ahead and goes, oh, this was just a placeholder for a parameter, right? And this parameter in this case is ID. It will not give you the params from our backend because we haven't made any requests yet, right? Params on the backend means, hey, this is some information that came over with the body or the URL of a request, right? Params here just means anything we typed into the URL. And that's just specifically when it comes to properties. Params is a very broad word. It can mean a bunch of different things in encoding terms. In this case, it is anything that we type into the path that we had said, if you type this into the path, go into our params. So when I say right here, right here, now if I go to our restaurant index and I do grab our little import use history from React router DOM console.log, or sorry, use params. Whoops. Use params, right? Now, if I go to /restaurants, it'll be confused by me. But if I go to Batman, Robin, it will go ahead and not match that because this is this chip. I was trying to make this a simple explanation, but here, now this is more specific. And now you'll see Squirtle is equal to Batman, Robin is equal to YOLO, where Batman is what I typed in here. If I did cheese instead, it's going to say Squirtle is equal to cheese, YOLO is equal to Robin. And the only thing that happened is I went ahead and in my path, I said, this needs to be a param called Squirtle. This needs to be a param called YOLO. And anything we type into this gets put in as the value for Squirtle and YOLO respectively. Does that make sense? So when I type Batman into this section, it gets Squirtle equal to Batman. I type Robin into this one, we get YOLO equal to Robin. Cool. Boop. Nice. Get rid of this stuff again. And now we can go ahead and start doing our actual fetch. So first off, we have a couple things from our action creators. Boop. We need to import. So first off, we import connect from React Redux so we can begin connecting our component to Redux. And we don't need to really worry about the map state to props for now. We will eventually need to. But then we can import our action creators. Get restaurant from /redux/action creators. And then we can pass it in to our map state to props object. Restaurants. There we go. Talking and doing stuff at once. If I give this a null for now. Cool. So what we're doing here, any of these action creators that get shoved into this object right here get passed in as props. So we can console log props.get restaurant. And you'll see that we now have a function that returns dispatch to action creator, blah, blah, blah. And this is something we can go ahead and use to send our fetch for us. Cool. I'm going to actually destructure this real quick. Get restaurant. I might regret that later. But now we can go ahead and use it the same way we did our restaurant index, right? We can go ahead and use our use effect. Import use effect from React. Cool. And then here we can go ahead and say use effect, pass in our function get restaurant that we're grabbing from props and give it a parameter of get restaurant. And I'm also going to, because we're using our route ID, I'm going to give it a parameter of route ID. So now if route ID changes, it'll go ahead and run this again. And that's all we need to do to make it run it again. There's going to be one more change I'm going to make to this. But by making a route ID into a dependency, right? We can, first off, let me test out my theory because this is also still new to me a little bit. Boop. Console.log getting restaurant. Why are we setting it to, oh, right. Whoops. Well, cool. Look, we are getting a restaurant, which is from our dispatch, and getting restaurant from here. If I switch this to 13, it refreshes because some weird stuff happened. But eventually we can probably change it. We can like prove that. Let's go ahead and let's add a little. Let's test out that this will change if we change our app. I'm gonna go ahead and add this little div, add a little link to /restaurants /route ID +1 parse in. Go to next restaurant. Let's double check that this actually works before I talk a lot about it. Oh, right. Get rid of this. So here what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to add a link to go to the next restaurant by ID, which isn't a useful feature for our final app, right? But it should make getting restaurant console log again, and then give us a new restaurant. Try this out. Boop. Getting restaurant. Look, we were getting a restaurant /restaurants. Ooh, interesting. Oh, right. Oh, this is actually a hugely important thing that you will see a couple of times. I'm going to show you that in a second. Ooh, okay. Let's here we go. Restaurants 12. Restaurants 13. Restaurants 14. We are getting new restaurants each time. This becomes way easier as a componented update. We just say, hey, whenever the route ID changes, just run this again. By adding it to our dependencies, it's running this again for us with a new ID. Do people see that that's working? How are we feeling on that? Thumbs up, thumbs sideways, thumbs down. It's a really cool feature, use effect. It goes ahead and says, yeah, we're eventually going to have reviews. That's probably going to be a next week thing. And then we're going to have users as a final thing, I think. One heads up, if you forget to put the slash here, it's going to get weird on you. Specifically, it's now saying restaurant/16. It goes ahead And if you don't put a slash in front of your path, it'll assume that you want it to be a relative path to the path you're on right now. So it'll just tack it on to the end of your current path rather than onto the root path. So I'm going to go ahead, change this back to slash, show you what I mean. Boop. Now, if I refresh this page, go to next restaurant, we'll go to 16, right? But if I get rid of the slash, then this becomes slash restaurants slash 16. So, or slash 17. So I go to next restaurant. Oops, forgot to save. Boop. This now makes it a relative path. Cool. So I've just seen students get that error before. Want to warn you, just add a slash beforehand if you want to make sure it's always to your root path. Gonna get rid of this tool now. And we can go ahead. And start building this show page out. I'm going to give this a class name of show because I think that's how I styled it last time. I'm going to give this, and then we are going to go ahead and we need to start connecting our state from our store. Const map state to props equals take in our state and return state selected restaurant. We're just going to destructure everything from state.selected restaurant because that's a huge object. And we're going to return all of its keys and values. Check that this works. Console.log props. I'm going to temporarily change this to props in general so we can see all of them. Oops. Sorry, I just messed everything up. Just trying to make that way more easy and just made it way worse. Cool. So we're going to take this as props. Now we're just calling this props like a restaurant. We're testing that everything still works. Cool. All right, cool. Well, nice. So now if we console log our props, we don't get it. Right, map stage props right here. Pass in our map stage props function. Double check that this all works. Nice. So now we console log this. We have a bunch of different props. We have a get restaurant function, as well as an address, an ID, an image, a kind of food, latitude, longitude, name, and zip code. I'm just gonna really quickly pull over our reducer so we can see everything we're about to do, and then we'll just destructure it. So get restaurant, back to get restaurant, name, URL, lat, long, image, URL, address, kind of food, zip code. Now we don't need to call props on any of that. Get rid of our word props, and we can begin coding things out as per usual. Image source equals image, oops, image URL alt equals name. We can actually make this an href. Goes to URL. This one's just going to go right off the page. So if they click it, we don't need to use React Router because we're sending them somewhere else. P kind of food. Let's go ahead and see what this does. Nice. What was the weirdest part of what we just did? How are we all feeling?
So you're pretty much displaying what's on the show for that specific instance restaurant. So like the URL name, the kind of food and address.
Yeah, let's actually go through this code line by line. I think that's a really good thing to be doing, right? First line right here. Well, really, first line here, we're destructuring what we're getting from our props at selected restaurant, which starts out as just this null object, right? It's got a name of an empty string, URL of an empty string, image URL of an empty string. If we refresh the page, you will notice there's a brief moment if we go ahead and we run this very slowly. Where at first it's got an empty image where it's broken because it doesn't have any of this image, like because it's feeding in this empty string, right? First thing that happens is when you render any component, it runs its render method. So here, that's this bad boy. It runs its return statement. Not its render method because this is a functional component, but apart from that, this is a goofy way to style it, but YOLO. So first things first, right? Destructures all of these empty arguments from our reducer. And the way it does that is we've got this map state to props here, which is saying, hey, grab the state from our reducer and give me into our props only the props from the selected restaurant object inside of your state. Passes all of these in as variables, as well as my get restaurant method from our action creators, right? Which we can go ahead and use to make our fetch. Next, we have here this use effect, which is our way of wrapping all of our component lifecycle methods in one. And what this is saying is, hey, when this page loads, and whenever either the get restaurant function, which will never change, or the route ID function, which might change, changes, go ahead and run this get restaurant method with the key, with an argument of route ID. This then goes to our action creator where we have thunk right here, taking in that ID, making a fetch to our backend, then dispatching, once it gets our restaurant back, dispatching it to our reducer with a payload of that restaurant. Our reducer then looks at the type of that action, sees, oh, it's get restaurant. Then it console logs, here's the payload from that action, which we gave it right here. And then it updates our selected restaurant with the action.payload. Once the selected restaurant updates, React knows to go ahead and re-render our component. And that's all of the stuff that's happening here. There's a lot of stuff that React is just doing for us if we follow certain patterns. But what we're really doing is, first off, oh, sorry, I skipped this part. Grab the ID from our route, right? Go ahead, when you load the page, make a fetch to get restaurant using our get restaurant method with this ID that we're passing in. Go to our action creator, dispatch this once you're done with your fetch. Dispatch this once you're done with your fetch. Go to our reducer, update our state, and then back in our restaurant show, our map state to props sees like, hey, these are new props, passes in the new props, and we rerun our render method. And that's what's really happening under the hood. That's all of it. It's a lot. What's the most confusing part of it? Y'all feeling okay? Thumbs up, thumbs sideways, thumbs down. Okay. The last weird thing though, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to start adding a navbar component real quick. Boop. Let's go ahead, add nav. we can create that in our components. Nav.js function, nav. I'm going to give this a little, is there a nav HTML element? We'll see. Yes, there is a nav tag. Cool. Here, I'm going to give this a nav link to restaurants. See all restaurants. I'm going to export default nav. I'm going to add that to our components right here. Export. Add this into our app. Now we should have what am I thinking of here? Well, navlink is also weird anyways. I'm just gonna go ahead and do this. Oh, right, React Router DOM. That was the issue. I'm gonna do this and then I probably am gonna switch it back. Why are you mad? Right, return, classic JavaScript problem. Oh, there we are. Cool. You saw that loaded really slowly, really quickly, really, because our fetch is going slower here. I want to flag one specific issue that we're going to be having. If I click check, for a second I see dig, and then it updates to check. Can anyone tell me why? If I go back to see all.
Was
Yeah,
it still
go.
set? That was the old version that was still set, and we didn't unmount it.
Yeah,
rather
exactly.
than-
Unmounted is a specific term, but you're exactly right here. This right here was updated. Our selected restaurant was updated to what we got back from the fetch the first time. And a restaurant or any React component will always render before it does any side effects. So it's going to render this. It's going to grab our old state from our old restaurant, and then it's going to render that restaurant instead for a second. Then our asynchronous call for use effect will eventually get its response back from the server, update it, and then re-render the page with the right stuff. But this is gross. This is an awful way for a user to operate. You think for like a good second that this is the wrong thing, right? So if we want to solve this, we should really clean up after ourselves when we leave our show page for a restaurant. Now, use effect. Usually we would use component will unmount, right? But since we're using hooks, I want to show you just what use effect will do for this. Use effect has a very straightforward way of passing in cleanup actions. Your function that use effect calls. So in this case, this anonymous function that calls get restaurant, if that function returns a function, it will run that on cleanup. So I'm going to return a function. I'm going to call cleanup. And here I'm just going to console.log. We are leaving this page and this component is unmounting. Cool. And I'm just gonna add some indentation so this is a little more obvious. Cool. So now we're gonna refresh. Ooh, this is getting slow. Now if I click here, We are leaving this page and this component is unmounting. Cool. Anything we pass in as a function in the return statement of our use effect function will be run when we're cleaning up. It doesn't need to be called cleanup. I can go ahead and make this an anonymous function right here. That's fine. I'm going to call it cleanup so that everyone knows what's up. But if our use effect function returns a function, it will run it on cleanup. So next up, I'm going to make a tool we can use to clean up our app. But before that, do people see what I just did really quickly? It's a little weird, right? But remember, JavaScript functions can return functions all the time. In this case, I'm returning a cleanup function, and that's how use effect works. Be all cool? So now I'm going to do a case that I'm going to call clear restaurant. And now I don't really want to write all this again. So one thing I can do, I can go ahead and change my code a little bit to be like const initial restaurant equals loop. Oops, no. There we are. Boop. There we
So
are.
it's the same as like emptying out a form once the user submits it, right? Just blanking it out.
Yeah. So now I can just be like, hey, selected restaurant here is now our initial restaurant again. Cool. Since I didn't want to write it twice, I wrote it once and put it in a variable and then use that variable twice. Did I do any magic for anybody? Are we all cool with variables? This was originally right here, this whole object. I turned it into a variable that I passed in both here and here. So now clear restaurant is just going to go ahead and take all these and then make them the key for a selected restaurant. I'm going to go ahead and now add that to our action creators. Export const clear restaurant. And this one doesn't need to do anything fancy. It can just return the object directly because we're not doing any side effects. Cool. And then in our restaurant show page, go ahead, import clear restaurant, pass it in to our map dispatch props, clear restaurant, and then make sure it's also in our regular key structured props. And now, if we want to get really fancy with the spices, you can go ahead and do this. Let's go check out that this works. Oop. Ooh. Now we go here, go back. Whoa, did I mess this up?
Right. Is it action? Is it type instead of action?
Yes, whoops, nice. Good eye there. Cool. All right, let's actually go ahead. Now we're doing this clear restaurant. Our restaurant show page is using that clear restaurant that we're getting here. Are we correctly calling this our reduce? First off, console. You think that it needs parentheses? I don't think we should return it with as if we invoke it here, then it will return undefined, right? See all restaurants. We get a hello. Oh, it worked. Did I just not save everything? I bet I didn't save something. This is still a terrible user experience. We might add a loading spinner really quickly. But and the last thing, it is going ahead and saying, hey, you haven't given us this dependency for this new function clear restaurant. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now just to make React happy. Cool. You can get rid of that console log hello. Our reducer. Boop. And let's go ahead and steal a loading spinner from something. Loading spinner. HTML CSS. Zuzu, so close to being done. You gotta chill. Okay, cool. Let's grab this one really quickly. And then we can go ahead and say like const spinner equals loop, const loaded page equals this bad boy. And now I can go ahead and say, hey, if there is, still work, right? I can go ahead and say like, if there is a, let's grab the ID also from here. If we have an ID from the backend, go ahead and produce loaded page. Otherwise, produce the spinner. Why are you mad at me? I'm also probably going to make these functions. I think it'll probably, that probably solves my problem. I don't want to make it a constant because it's subject to change. Anyone see why it's mad at me? Aside from a bunch of reasons. Let's save this, see if it throws me a different error. All right. We're not in JavaScript yet. That's why. Cool. We're not in JSX yet, so we didn't need those curly brackets. And yeah, I need mean class name. Cool. And then I'm just going to copy this loader CSS from our W3 schools. All right. I'm going to make this huge, more huge. Centered. Let's see what we've got here. Not great, but it exists. Well, make it also have a huge little Let's go ahead and try this one more time. That's perfect. I'm not going to make any changes to that. So what we're doing here is we're saying like, hey, if, oops, let's go over to our reducer. Close all these other tabs. Open up a reducer again. Oh, right. ID. I'm actually going to make these null. I feel like that's a more accurate 0. I think that was a slip up to go ahead and call them 0. But now we're saying like, hey, if the ID is null, go ahead and load the spinner. But once the ID isn't null, go ahead and load our whole page. And the way we did that right here is we just went ahead and said like, hey, is there an ID from our props? If so, go ahead and show the load page. Otherwise, go ahead and show the spinner. Cool. Raquel, what's up?
So once the ID updates in the state, that's when the page updates, and then the spinner, I mean, the ID is true, and then the spinner goes away.
Exactly correct.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. This is probably as much as we're going to get done today because we have 4 more minutes left. What do we still need to talk about? Is there anything that really stumped people while I was going through this? I feel bad that for all the time I've spent teaching class components, I found it just, I started wanting to write hooks instead here. And now this is all hooks based, but now you're learning hooks.
I definitely have to rewatch this.
Yeah, there's also like a lot of just like small things that I like briefly covered off on that I probably should have like thrown in a readme somewhere as we were doing them. But these are errors that you'll all find on your own too. Cool. All right, I'm going to end this. Thank you all for joining. Oh, logistics, I forgot to mention. Corinna is going to be covering for me. So she's going to be opening up some office hours for next week if I'm in jury duty. And you can just Slack her the same way you would Slack me. Just treat her as alternate me. She also has a huge palette of nerdy opinions and fandoms. So just whatever you'd send me, if I don't have my phone on, send it to her. I will try to keep my phone on. But jury duty sometimes has opinions about like, hey, no phones in a courtroom. So that's something we're gonna have to deal with. Cool. I'll let you all know as soon as I know things about my jury duty. Cool. Later, everyone.
Like, so we won't work on a project next week?
Yes, you will work on your project.
No,
I would-
like what you were doing, the demo project.
If I'm back from jury duty by Tuesday, we'll do it on Tuesday. Otherwise, I'm just gonna postpone whatever we're doing to when I'm back from jury duty.
Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you.